안보 아키텍처의 변화를 주제로 컨퍼런스 1부회의를 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 안내해드린 대로 제1부회의 사회는 하영수 교수님께서 맡아주시겠습니다. 그럼 지금부터 제1부회의를 시작하겠습니다.
Our first session will mainly focus on changes in East Asian security architecture. To have a new perspective on this new emerging issues, we invited three globally well-known scholars on these issues of each country: United States, China, and South Korea. From the U.S., Dr. Michael O. Hanlon. He is a senior fellow in foreign policy at the Brookings Institute, mainly focusing on the U.S. defense strategy. And secondly, we also invited the Professor Tong Mang. He is now teaching at the School of International Studies, Beijing University. Also served as a director of the Center for Northeast Asian Strategic Studies, Beijing University. And lastly, from the Korean side, Professor Chae-Sung Chang. He is teaching now at the Seoul National University on the international relations, and also he is now playing the role of the director of Asian Security Initiative, East Asian Institute. After having three very substantive presentation, we will have a comments and discussion from another internationally well-known scholars. As a first discussion, Professor Che Gang, Institute of Foreign Affairs and National Security. And secondly, Masayuki Masuda, National Institute for Defense Studies from Japan. And lastly, Mark Manning from the U.S. Congressional Research Service. We are a little bit to follow the tight schedule. It seems that each presentation will be done in 15 minutes, and after that there will be a comments and questions roughly around 5 minutes each from the discussants. Would like to hand over the microphone to Dr. Michael O'Hanlon.
Thank you, Professor, and good morning, everyone. It's a great treat to be here, and I will try to actually complete my thoughts in 12 minutes to set things off. We'll see if I can keep to that. There are really just two main ideas that I wanted to put on the table in the beginning of our discussion this morning, following the distinguished remarks of the distinguished foreign minister. And one is how to think about this question of American decline, as it's been described already this morning in opening remarks. And as many around the region and the world are contemplating, what does American decline mean? How serious is it? What should we do about it? And then the second issue is a more specific set of remarks about U.S. defense strategy and the defense budget in light of this challenge of America's economic and budgetary problems, in light of the discussion of decline, and in light of all that's going on in Washington these days. I don't expect that you should be following every detail, but you know we are already obliged to cut $400 billion over 10 years from the previous plan of defense spending. And now there is a possibility that the cuts could be even twice that size, close to $1 trillion over 10 years. So I'll come back to that in a moment. But let me begin, as I promised, with the discussion of decline and what this means. I agree the United States has some very serious problems. And I think we all know this. Certainly 3 straight years of deficits over $1 trillion each year indicate a very, very significant economic challenge to the country's future prosperity. Certainly the thinning out of American manufacturing remains and poses a very serious long-term concern about America's industrial and military strength. Certainly our politics seem somewhat broken and troubled, with Republicans and Democrats unable to compromise on many issues, and now perhaps all of this combining into the possibility of a second recession, which would have implications throughout the world, given how much all of us are interconnected. All of that is true, all of that is serious, but I'm not going to talk about that anymore. I'm going to talk about why we need to stay positive and optimistic. And I'm going to look at the other side of the coin. Now, this is not a prescription for complacency. We need to do some big things to fix our budget and economic problems, and I'm going to give one set of prescriptions in just a minute on defense and how we do need to find ways to be more economical and more efficient in our defense plan. I strongly support the planned defense spending reductions that are already mandated by the August budget law. I strongly support roughly $400 billion in 10-year cuts, and I think we can do that in a way that preserves our strength and our alliances in the Western Pacific and the Persian Gulf and elsewhere. I don't think we can go deeper than $400 billion prudently, so I agree with Secretary Panetta and the Obama administration. But we do need to get serious about the budget. But let me, before I get to that, talk about all the strengths that we need to bear in mind. And there's no better place to do this than in Korea, because the U.S. ROK alliance represents all that has been successful about our foreign policy and your foreign and domestic policy. Yes, you can say American economic strength is less relative to China or relative to India or relative to the rising West. But if you look at the democratic system of states that share values in the protection of the individual right, share values in promotion of economic growth, in the value of democracy, in the value of the peaceful resolution of disputes, the United States and its partners are in the best place in history we have ever been. It's very important not to lose sight of that. Speaking from an American point of view, we have some 65 allies around the world of one type or another, including the ROK. The ROK, in my opinion, is one of our 5 most important. But we have 65. Now, yes, our allies get mad at us. Yes, sometimes Korean friends get mad at us. No one follows our every lead, nor should they. But at the end of the day, we stick together because we know that in the end, the alliance is a useful part of the international architecture. It's not necessarily a hedge against anyone. It's more of a foundation or a pillar in the international system's basic workings. And it works. It works in East Asia, it works in the Persian Gulf, it works in Europe. Never before has a country like the United States maintained 65 alliances in the absence of an obvious threat. Now, for certain countries, they might say China's a potential threat or Russia's a potential threat, but there is no big menace that everyone agrees upon. But we still stay together because we realize the value of these alliances. The fact that the rest of the world has risen, really led by Korea in many ways, in an earlier period, this is a success for the values and the concepts that Americans and others of similar perspectives around the world have been championing since World War II. We set up an international trade and investment system to create the conditions for others to prosper. The rise of the rest is what American foreign policy was trying to accomplish. Now, sometimes we Americans forget that. We get nervous. We see China rising, India rising, Brazil rising, our own economy flat. And we wonder what's going on. Even countries, even good friends like Korea make us a little nervous because of trade issues sometimes. And we wonder what's going on. And yes, we do have deep-seated anxieties. But we must not forget all of our strengths. And we must not forget that the world we have today is actually the world we were trying to help bring about in the post-World War II system of alliances, economic relationships, and working partnerships. So, a few more things about America's and Korea's strengths. And let me speak quickly from an American point of view. We still account for 1/3 of all global research and development. That's a pretty good foundation from which to remain economically strong. We still have more than half of the world's best 100 universities, as reflected in the estimates of various think tanks that do these kinds of estimates. We still rank 5th in the World Economic Forum Competitiveness Index. Now, we used to be number 1 or number 2. So 5 seems like it's headed in the wrong direction, but I think you know who's ahead of us. Sweden, Singapore, Finland, Switzerland. 4 very small countries, all of which are also our friends, and to some extent our security partners. So among the world's big economies, the United States is still seen to have a lot of strengths. I could go on, but one more thing is worth mentioning, which is, and again, Koreans contribute to this in many ways, and Koreans obviously contribute to our strong universities because a number of you and a number of your countrymen have been part of our university system at one time in your lives or another, and you obviously have a strong university system too. But one more thing we need to bear in mind, that the great strength of the United States is the openness of our immigration policies. Now, these policies have big problems right now. We can't figure out how to deal with illegal immigrants from Central America. We don't take in enough people who have high skill sets. We take students, bring them to the United States, and then don't let them stay after they finish. So we do a lot of things wrong, specifically. But we are still seen as one of the world's great melting pots, one of the great places where people can come together under a common set of ideas and ideals. And this gives our country great strength, and it's one of the reasons all of our alliances work so well. I don't mean to sound nationalistic. I'm trying to defend the ideals, principles, and values that we share across the Pacific with a good friend and ally like Korea, which have been at the foundation of our alliance. So all that's the good news. And that means we shouldn't view our alliances as trying to hedge against China or deal with the threat of China, but rather to think of them as providing a sort of anchor or a framework within which other relationships can thrive in the Western Pacific, including good relationships with China. These do not have to be viewed as competitive, different kinds of institutions, or mutually exclusive in any way. And nor do I think we should use the term hedge so much, because we're not so much trying to hedge China against China, we're trying to simply shape the way in which China's rise works within the broader community in the Western Pacific in a productive way for everyone. And I think the strategy is working, as reflected in the fact that Koreans are smart enough to know that you don't want to pick a fight between China and the United States. You don't want to get involved in the middle of a squabble. And you think that, in fact, if everyone stays calm and keeps working on their problems in a responsible, constructive way, we can avoid those kinds of choices. And I think Korean sensibilities are very strong in that regard. Just a couple words to try to keep to my 12-minute promise on defense strategy. If we're going to cut the United States defense budget by about $400 billion over 10 years, it's still going to be about as big as it was in the Reagan administration. It's still going to be $500 billion a year, measured in 2012 dollars. In fact, it'll be more than that for a while because the war costs are on top of the $500 billion. But it's still going to be big. And I think we can find a way to keep our strength quite impressive, even as we make those cuts. And I'll give you just 1 or 2 examples of how we can do that. One example is an aircraft that I know is of interest and a discussion in Korea today, as well as in the United States, the F-35, the Lightning II. Right now, you might buy this. We plan to buy 2,500 of this type of airplane. We don't need 2,500. Not in an era of drones, not in an era of increasingly powerful and effective precision strike munitions. We can target the number of F-35s that we buy more to the specific challenges and the specific basing possibilities we have in the Western Pacific and Persian Gulf. And we can buy somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500, and that's enough, in my opinion. One more example. Right now, the U.S. Navy, as you know, generally rotates its ships in the Western Pacific from American ports, and a few are based in Japan. But primarily our ships that operate in this region are based in California or other American ports, and they sail across the ocean. They spend maybe 4 or 5 months on station in the Western Pacific, and they go home, so that sailors never spend more than 6 months in a row at sea. And that's one of the reasons why the Navy wants to increase the size of the fleet today by 10%. The U.S. Navy wants to increase the size of the fleet by 10%. Unfortunately, we don't have the money to talk that way, and the Navy's going to have to get more creative. So what I would suggest, and this is a concept we've already experimented with, and we've already employed it on minesweepers. When the sailors get close to the end of their 6-month time at sea, Don't bring the ship home. Leave the ship here for a while and swap the crews by airplane. There's been a lot of study done on how to do this. And it's not something you can take too far. You need a certain amount of capability for possible warfighting scenarios. You don't want to do this for every ship in your fleet, especially not big ships like aircraft carriers. But for our major surface combatants, this idea could allow us to shrink the size of the fleet a little more and still maintain all the presence we currently maintain in the Western Pacific. I don't want to go through a lot of military jargon and military technicalities today, but that's an example of what I think we can do. That's why we can make $400 billion in cuts without harming our position in this region. And that's what I hope will be the extent of our budget reductions in the near future. Now, if the reductions have to be twice that big, it's much more complex. And I hope that does not happen. We don't yet know. I'll save that discussion for the follow-on period. But 400 billion or so, which is what's currently required, we could do that and stay very strong in the Western Pacific, as I believe we should. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Harlan raised two very important issues. The first one is how we should evaluate the U.S. power in the 21st century, not only focusing on the negative side, but also we should counter the positive side of the U.S. The second point is related with the economization of the military budget without having a negative impact on the military assurance. I think we have a very interesting discussions on these two issues. Next presenter will be Professor.
Thank you, Professor Ha. And I also would like to thank EAI for allowing me to participate in this distinguished guest. In my presentation, I'm going to discuss look at the continuity and the changes in China's foreign policy by examining the so-called Chinese assertiveness. I think recently the discourse of Chinese assertiveness has been increasingly on the rise in the Western media and policy community, and I think I don't need to go down the list of the beliefs of Chinese assertiveness. And this discourse also holds that China's turning assertive is a break from its decade-long successful strategy of reassurance and charm offensive, and indeed has signified a quote-unquote fundamental shift in China's foreign policy. In my own article, I suggest that China's turning aggressive discourse has paid insufficient amount of attention to some deeper factors, both structural and perceptual, of China's foreign policies, therefore largely ignoring the much more fundamental continuity in China's foreign policy. For the sake of time in my presentation, I will just focus on two issues. One is that I will look at what has been missing in this picture, the so-called China turning assertive thesis. And secondly, I will also look at examine some new trends in China's foreign policy and discuss the question whether or not those new trends has led to the changes in China's foreign policy behavior. One of the most prominent cases of China's assertiveness is of course China's very strong protest toward the United States after Obama administration announced its decision to sell $64 billion worth of weapons to Taiwan. And I'm taken aback by China's assertiveness. U.S. analysts began to attribute Chinese assertive behavior to the perceived shift in balance of power between China and the United States, and particularly the Chinese believe that the United States was in decline, especially since the 2008 global financial crisis. However, I think the view that the emboldened Chinese defiance of the hegemonic power of the United States may be incomplete or inaccurate on several grounds. Firstly, it may have missed the serious perception gap between two sides and ignored the self-righteousness existing on both sides. For American analysts and officials selling arms to Taiwan is completely legitimate because as it is required by law, the Taiwan Relations Act. Pointing to the fact that the United States has been selling arms to Taiwan for decades, many U.S. analysts actually came to view Chinese protests as quote-unquote ritualistic. Therefore, for those analysts, China's strong reactions were nothing but manifestation of assertiveness. However, I think such a view might have neglected the Chinese perspective. The matter of fact is that the Chinese have, from the very beginning, regarded U.S. arms sales to Taiwan as infringement to Chinese sovereignty. Chinese anger is genuine. I think if one reads the transcript of China's former paramount leader Deng Xiaoping's remarks at internal meetings, because myself also, I call myself a part-time historian, so I do a little bit of Cold War history. If we look at those historical evidence, I think we will be surprised at how generally Deng Xiaoping and other leaders, they were angry and indignant about U.S. decision to continue to sell arms to Taiwan even after normalization. For instance, in June 1981, Deng Xiaoping told an enlarged meeting of the Standing Committee of the Chinese Communist Party Politburo and said that China, quote-unquote, should not take a vague stand, 不能含糊其辞, on U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, and adding that China should not fear a retrogression in U.S.-China relations. This is just a very one small example. Therefore, I think there is a very serious perception gap actually exists between Beijing and Washington. While there seems to be a sort of taking for granted on part of the U.S. strategic analysts and officials when it comes to the issue of U.S. arms sale to Taiwan, I think Chinese regarding the sales as infringement to Chinese sovereignty are generally angry about it. So I think this factor, perceptual factor, I think we ought to take into account when analyzing Chinese reactions. Secondly, I think such a view generally is based on anecdotal evidence analysts garner from interviews or reading of news stories. But I think to gauge overall Chinese mood, we need to look at some more systemic evidence. For instance, polling data. To give one example, I think a nationwide survey conducted by Global Times, a leading newspaper in China, in August 2010 shows that altogether 52% of the survey public either believe that China is a quote-unquote second-rate power, 二等国家, or China is a quote-unquote weak power, 弱国. Moreover, I think the perception of China rising and the United States U.S. declining is fleeting. Buoyancy in public moods, if any, was only temporary. A 5-year poll conducted by the same newspaper between 2006 and 2010 reports that there are indeed consistently more Chinese public who believe that China has not become a world-leading power, so-called 世界型强国, except in 2008. And I think perhaps partly due to the global financial crisis, there was 28.8% of the survey public believe that China has already become a world-leading power, whereas only 20.1% believe the opposite. However, this quote-unquote triumphal mood, if any, quickly dissipated. The situation was almost reversed in 2009, even before China entered into this so-called difficult situation with a lot of its neighbors. The data reports in 2009, there was only 15.1% of the Chinese public believe that China has already become a world-leading power, whereas 25.7% believe the opposite. And the trend continued in 2010. And when a survey report, a record low of 12.5% of the Chinese public believe that China has already become a world-leading power, whereas the record high of 34.1% of the survey public believe the opposite. So I think, nevertheless, I think clearly, at least from the polling data, I think it does not support the view, a very simple view or assertion that the China become assertive. Indeed, I think Chinese public has over time seems to become more cautious in assessing China's international status. Now, next, I will move to look at some new trends in China's foreign policy policy, particularly. One is the pluralization of actors in China's foreign policy making. Another one is the rise of the nationalism. I think traditionally Chinese foreign policy making is highly centralized and out of view of the public. But as China was undergoing fundamental transformation in the past few decades, Chinese foreign policy making process has also undergone dramatic changes, and as a consequence, the agencies and actors in the foreign policy making process has much, leading oftentimes to problems in policy planning, coordination, and implementation. And not only so, and let me just give one example. Take for instance, Chinese leaders' efforts to try to reassure its neighbors and the international community has often been contradictory, if not sabotaged by quote-unquote poorly timed actions of official agencies. For instance, on June 3rd, 2011, Chinese Defense Minister Liang Guanglie was telling a gathering in the Shangri-La in Singapore that China is committed to quote-unquote community maintaining peace and stability in the South China Sea, and that China stood by the declaration of parties in the South China, so-called DOC. And the background was that just about a week ago, reportedly a Chinese patrol ship had cut off the cable of a Vietnamese Navy ships operating in the disputed waters. Shortly afterwards, China also sent out two vice chairmen of its Central Military Commission to try to reassure the ASEAN countries. However, on June 9th, just a few days later, another similar incident occurred. So apparently, I think there's a problem of coordination within the Chinese foreign policy making process. Not only so, I think the deficiencies in the institutional arrangement and the capacity building has also seriously impeded China's ability to effectively dealing with coastal challenges to its maritime security. And indeed, I think the uncoordinated and oftentimes confusing effort by those agencies to enforce maritime governance has been likened by analysts to so-called five dragons filling up the sea. We all know how. Despite all that, however, I think the rise of the weight and influence of some maritime regulatory agencies such as the China Maritime Surveillance (CMS), big oil companies, or the military might have formed what I label as a loose IRO triangle, which could to some extent, I think, explain China's assertiveness in maritime disputes in the South China Sea. But I think due to the opaque nature of China's foreign policy making process, we know little about this quote-unquote triangle. The nature and dynamics of the iron triangle will await future studies, although some preliminary evidence might point to that direction. For instance, there is a so-called China Energy Fund Committee, CEFC, a newly established self-proclaimed non-governmental think tank with support from some big energy companies and with connections to the military, has recently been advocating use of force to resolve disputes over the South China Sea. But I think the influence of this nascent iron triangle on China's foreign policy making should not be exaggerated. Despite the CEFC's advocating use of force to resolve maritime disputes in the South China Sea, such a position apparently did not get ear of Chinese higher leadership and didn't translate into policy preferences. Rather, I think Chinese government took steps to try to allay tensions and reassure ASEAN members by actively pursuing diplomacy and negotiations. On July 21st, 2011, China and ASEAN members signed the so-called in Bali, Indonesia, signed the so-called guidelines for the implementation of the DOC. Actually, a very significant step forward from the 2002 non-binding declaration of counterparties in South China Sea. Not only so, China has also actively engaged both Vietnam and Philippines in hopes of reducing tensions, avoiding collusion, and eventually reaching peaceful resolution of the disputes. And most recently, as we know, that Vietnam, just the Vietnamese leaders just had a very high-level official delegation visit Beijing, and the two sides signed an agreement to hold talks twice a year to resolve differences and to establish a hotline between Beijing and Hanoi. And indeed, they have proposed more than one hotlines as a crisis management mechanism. And also, the two sides issued a joint statement in which both sides agreed to try to seek a basic, quote-unquote, basic and long-term solution for sea-related issues in spirit of mutual respect, equal and mutually beneficial treatment. Next, I will look at briefly the rising nationalism and the question whether or not that leads to remorse to the public in China. That nationalism has been on the rise in China, has been well documented in the literature. And generally, I think a lot of analysts believe that nationalism was one of the main factors driving China's assertiveness in recent years. But I think reality might tend to be a little bit more complicated. For instance, a recent poll conducted by another leading Chinese newspaper, International Herald Leader, revealed that about 79% of the Chinese public poll endorsed the, I will call it, legalistic interpretation of sea power, viewing sea power as the maritime rights and benefit China enjoys according to international law, including the exclusive right of navigation, fishing, sea farming, exploration, and energy resources in territorial waters and the EEZs. In comparison, only about 16% of the surveyed public were taken what I call offensive realist interpretation of sea power, viewing sea power as something of the power to control or dominate sea. So I think the polling data give some evidence that the China public is not necessarily arrogant or assertive. When it comes to China's responses to maritime dispute, there is a very strong sense of self-righteousness on the part of both public and leaders in China that will see China's actions as quote-unquote logical and necessary responses to perceive the more active and even assertive stance by other claimants and or foreign entities in order to quote-unquote defend its policies and prevent an adverse change in the status quo. And this is the analysis conclusion I quote from two leading strategic analysts, Michael Swain and Taylor Friedel. Now, in conclusion, I think there's much of the continuity about in China's foreign policy can also be largely explained by, to a great extent, by China's grand strategy thinking, which is inward-oriented, which is inward-looking, preoccupied with and prioritized toward maintaining economic growth and domestic stability. And this is actually a strategic, something I would label as a strategic orientation, which I will label as a defensive realism consensus. This defensive realism policy consensus, I think, is also manifested in China's disputed territorial claims, as I showed in my own research here. But in conclusion, I think this is a sweeping discourse of China turning assertive might have neglected much of the continuities in China's foreign policy, and it ignores the perceptual gap between China and outside world that lacks a balanced and nuanced understanding of some of the more structural trends in China's foreign policy. At present and in the near future, I think there is no indication that China's strategic orientation will undergo a fundamental shift, and the equilibrium of defensive realism policy consensus will likely be maintained. However, I think we have also to confess how China's future strategic orientation might evolve is also a function of China's internal economic, social, political, as well as ideational processes. Therefore, China's strategic choices in the post-financial crisis era and beyond, I think, should be a subject that warrants continuous observation and further debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's go on introduce us to the explanation of so-called assertive Chinese diplomacy, and also gave us a picture of China perception of the U.S. foreign policy, in particular toward China, and also mentioned a little bit about present and future of China foreign policies from a little bit optimistic position. As a third speaker, I will invite Professor John. He will give us another very interesting perspective, how we should manage how we should view the current situation in East Asia, and also how we can cooperate to solve the dilemma we are now facing in this region. Professor John.
Thank you, Dr. Han. My proposal is to develop South Korea's strategic discourse, what we have to do between these two great powers, China and the United States. As we hear the presentations ahead of mine, China is developing still a very defensive realist type of strategy, which is good news, despite of all these difficult relations with the U.S. for the past 1 or 2 years. U.S., despite of the project cuts, will continue to engage with China, which is another good news. However, for South Korean side, we know that we have to develop a very good strategic relations both with the United States and China. However, still it's very abstract, and we have to develop a more detailed, some kind of medium range or micro or strategic discourses to guide the actual discourses. That's, I think, our final goal. It's very far from here to reach that, our purpose, so we are working on it. In this conference, the purpose of this conference is to hear from the U.S. and China and to learn from the other surrounding countries' strategy toward China and also the United States. What I find is that even though we have these modest discourses in both countries, still there are very conservative, the worst case type of scenarios in two countries. One from the United States, so-called offensive realism. The other one is from China, another type of offensive realism or some offensive type of civilizational discourses in developing so-called post-American hegemonic world from the Chinese side. The reason for this, I think, is uncertainty about the future. It's very uncertain what kind of bilateral relations between China and the United States will be. There are many reasons. First is that from the unit level, we have very specific two units, China and United States. United States, as Dr. Wang said, is the most strong, the most powerful hegemony in the world in our human history. China, as we know, is a very powerful, very civilized, the core of the civilization in East Asia. So from the historical knowledge or our theoretical perspective, it's very hard to predict about the specific relations of these two great powers. So that comes from the unit level. Another reason for this uncertainty is from the structural level. The 21st century type of international relations is transforming fundamentally from so-called modern or Westphalian type of international relations to something else. We have many different actors, many different issue areas, and the fundamental organizing principle of international relations is changing. So we don't know what kind of backgrounds, what kind of international settings will work for the bilateral relations for these two countries. The uncertainty about the future makes a very big, maybe too hasty predictions about the future because we don't know the details. Facts do not guide us in making strategic discourses. So it's very natural and understandable that we develop these very macro type of theoretical perspectives. However, we have the danger of falling into the so-called over-theorizing. We put too much theory in looking at the detailed facts. It's not just for scholars, it's also for the policymakers. They have their own discourses, they have their own ideas, and those ideas guide the actual policymaking process. If they have a conservative type of very realist ideas about the future, maybe 2020 or 2030, then we have a long shadow of the future drawn into the current process of policymaking. great powers are okay. If those predictions are wrong, they have the leeway to correct that. So South Korea, as a small country, will be in a very deep trouble if those big predictions is not right. If the process of mulling through to find the mutual strategic cooperation continues, it is very painful. So we are situated at the forefront between these two great powers. So we cannot but suffer not only from all-out final confrontation, but also from very small procedural disagreement based on perceived strategic mistrust between these countries. So one basic purpose of this work is to criticize pessimistic view in two countries. There are some detailed arguments. I will skip it for the interest of time. So the American pessimism, wrong, assumptions for the so-called offensive realists. They assume that China will grow strong and strong, and there will be a inevitable process of security and power maximization, and there will be a serious secret competition, which will lead to the final clash between these countries is inevitable. But there are severe, flaws in this logic. One is we cannot be sure that China will be strong enough to challenge American hegemony. The rise of China is the good news. However, we don't know what kind of rise will be. It will be, and we hope it will be engaged rise because it's a rise under the unipolarity and also very strong global governance. So if China want to rise, then there should be some inputs from the global society and also East Asian relations upon the specific way China rise. So the final end state of the China reason will be a more engaged one, but we hope so. But the offensive realist doesn't predict so. They just think that it will be a very strong, very antagonistic great power vis-a-vis the United States and the other states. This is a too hasty assumption, I think. And the more interesting thing is that all this realist logic is based upon the assumption of so-called anarchy, meaning that states are the most powerful unit or player. So much observed in the idea of military power or military maximization. However, as we see in the times of globalization, we saw many different actors, societal actors and supranational international organizations to guide the road of development, not just for China, but for the other states as well. So there are some assumptions which we can criticize when we view this American pessimism. We see another type of Chinese pessimism. Professor Ha touched upon this shortly during his keynote speech. So we have the counterpart of the Chinese pessimism. Also, and Professor Wang, very persuasively argued that we have a economic interdependence between China and the global international economic framework. But the offensive kind of line of argument do not pay close or enough attention to this, the power of economic interdependence or some transformational world politics toward more cooperative one. In China, he is developing the so-called soft power diplomacy or public diplomacy by enhancing its assertive power, which is also a good sign for adapting itself into a very rapidly developing international environment. We have to, there are so many stakeholders in East Asia, not just South Korea, but Japan, Taiwan, and other ASEAN countries, Australia, and they try to find out what kind of Chinese soft power will be. We want a very, universally minded China based upon the agreeable normative framework. Then can we go to the liberal or so-called constructivist optimism? Not very, because all these theoretical insights are developed on the basis of the international relations in the Western world. Liberal optimism is based upon the force of power, the mutual democracy, or the development of international institutions. However, in East Asia, we have many liberal society, and even in China we see the development of the market socialism. So there should be some market forces. However, in East Asia we have many developmental states, meaning that in developmental states the markets are oriented or guided by states, the interest of the states, China as well. So if political judgment that we have to do something, for example, to have a more conservative policy against the United States, then the market forces will be more or less powerless in the assuaging the possible confrontation with the United States. So the liberal optimism based on the market force will not have that much power in the developing the cooperative relations between China and the United States. Also institutions, there are so many institutions in East Asia, like ARF, APEC, ASEAN, +3. So some people, some liberal predict that we'll have a more cooperative role. But the question is, why do we so many institutions? Because we want to balance against each other under the institutional settings. So institutions will contribute to the development of cooperation to some degree. However, it's the form of institutional balancing with each other. They want to have their own institutions to maximize their empowerment. So the liberal expectations will not come true that much. Constructivist argument, well, if we read many American constructivist arguments, we have to socialize China according to the so-called universal norms like democracy and human rights. However, we should not make too hasty efforts to socialize China, in line with only American way of thinking. I'm not criticizing American value system, but we needed to have a more universal in mind, not just this type of liberal democracy. With that, we can develop a broader one, so that China can agree to this new value system. So the constructive argument is true to some degree, but we have to make some adjustments. For minutes, South Korea's position, the bottom line. Well, we know that we have to have a very good relationship both with China and the United States in terms of strategy. However, I think the more fundamental purpose of South Korea is to have a East Asian regional order, flexible enough to permit balance of benefits and rights according to the balance of power. So China can rise because they try hard. What we need is a very flexible regional order to observe that. So the uneven development of national power is very natural. The issue is whether there is systemic flexibility or adaptability to adjust new distribution of power. There could be power transition, or there could be still the American hegemony. But the issue is, and for South Korea, because we have very critical issues in the procedural way. So we need to clear the way with more mechanisms of dispute settlement and of preventing specific issues from escalating into strategic confrontation. As we witnessed last year, we have small issues like post-Cheonan, the sea drill, military drill. China has a lot of reason to misunderstand this move, because they think that this is anti-China containment type of military drill between South Korea and the United States. So it easily escalates into strategic issues, but it's against North Korea's provocations based upon the strategic view of how to engage with China and North Korea. There should be more strategic dialogue, not just at the government level, but also civil society level. So the rise of China, I think there is some positive elements in guiding this new type of power transition, because it's I call soft rise in the field of soft power, and post-Westphalian rise, because it's a rise within the network type of governance. It's engaged rise. China is developing under the framework of the liberal international order, so they are adapting themselves to this new order. But there is an argument of re-rise of Chinese civilization, which might be offensive, or which might be contribute to the international the new situations in the 21st century. So we hope that this kind of post-Westphalian transition will end up with a very peaceful end state and also with very peaceful procedure in which South Korea can put much input in dealing with detailed issues. I will not go deep into the detailed each policy things, but two things. One is ROK-U.S. alliance. We have multi-layered or dimensional alliance, as our minister just said. But the alliance, the purpose of the alliance is not against a specific enemy or threat anymore in the 21st century. We want to balance against any uncertainty or any threats that will hurt the national interest of ROK-U.S. and also the other East Asian countries as well. So the concept of the alliance itself is transforming. And our strategic cooperation with China, all these misunderstandings are due to the lack of strategic dialogue. We don't have the common, the perspective of the future of North Korea. Yesterday we had a small talk with Professor Wang, and as we talk more and more, we have a very common view about the future of China, the future of North Korea. So we need a multi-level exchange of officials and diverse conferences for strategic dialogue. So in conclusion, so what we need is to evade this over-theorization, and especially from the great powers, we have to develop our own very detailed procedural discourses about the rise of China and their relations. And we want to, South Korea is forced to be good, because if we want to pursue our national interests, then I think we will fail. So we are some kind of global metropolitan to import a very universal global norms into the region and into the bilateral relations between these two countries.
Okay, thank you. John gave us another interesting view on the analysis of current East Asian international order and also new architecture in this region. After giving some evaluation of two contending perspectives on the future of U.S. and China in a little bit critical way, and as an alternative view, he proposed a little bit much more sophisticated and complex approach to solve the current dilemmas and also build the new architecture in the region. After having three very well presented views, we will have a further discussions. I will invite the first discussing Professor Chigang to give some comments and questions on the presentation.
Thank you, Professor Ha. I'd like to thank EAI for having me here, along with the distinguished scholars and experts. I enjoyed Dr. O'Hanlon's paper very much and also enjoyed his presentation. I agree with what he has said in this morning. As a commentator or discussant, I have to make some comments and questions on his paper and views. First, I think that he illustrates only the one side, as military aspect, such as budget cut. And I wonder what would be the U.S. policy toward East Asia. From the beginning of Obama administration, we have been waiting for the release of the U.S. version of East Asian policy, or EASR or EAS2. Still, of course, United States to be more active in East Asia or Asia Pacific region. Unfortunately, for the past 3 years, excepting joining, maybe this in November, actually, the United States is going to become a regular member of the EAS. But actually, further than that, what would be the U.S. policy, general policy toward East Asia? I think that is more fundamental question than just focusing on the military aspect. That actually leads me to second. Actually, it seems to me that Dr. O'Hanlon illustrated the pros and cons of defense budget cut. But anyway, it is inevitable for the United States to cut the budget. $400 billion, that's already agreed. But actually, the special commission has to work on the further defense budget cut issue. But if they fail, I think there will be automatically $600. I don't know whether it's automatic or not. When this automatically $600 billion further cut will be implemented. So actually, the reality, I subscribe myself to a little bit pessimistic on the agreement can be reached between Republican and Democrats in the capital area. So actually, we have to think about maybe the unthinkable things at this point of time. So if that's the case, the U.S. strategy to East Asia will be highly affected not by the security environment or security situation in Asia-Pacific region or East Asia, but it's money-driven adjustment. But actually that raised some concerns across the Pacific or its allies very much. So is it possible to redress these kinds of trends in U.S. politics, and also there should be a close consultation between the United States and its allies, how they are going to implement the budgetary issues, and also how they are going to share the roles and missions in the down the road. But unfortunately, we have not specified what kinds of division of labor we can do in upcoming years by taking into account the current trends of change in the region as well as the globe. I think that kind of strategic dialogue is very necessary for us to have, especially among the allies. That's one. It seems to me that the other point I'd like to ask, like, for example, maybe United States can feel safe 6,000 miles away from from Seoul, but actually the feeling here is a little bit different, maybe a little bit greater than the US, and also maybe much more direct with the changes that were happening in East Asian region very much. So it is very necessary for U.S. and its allies to have a rather common understanding of what the current trends and also challenges ahead of us. Another question that actually leads to the burden sharing issue. Because fortunately, that actually is necessary for the United States and South Korea to have a negotiation on defense burden share, the special measures agreement. By 2013 is the year we will begin the negotiation. But I think that the money terms is the issue. I think there are some the frictions even between the allies based upon my observation of the negotiation between the United States and South Korea. So it's quite necessary to resolve the issue, but there's going to be quite challenging. Maybe there's some pressures coming from the United States to ask its allies to assume the much more less responsibility, including the financial burden on itself. So what is the rule in Washington D.C.? Of course, it's just hypothetical one, but I think I'd like to ask that question for you. And when I come to more specifics, I'm a little bit puzzled by the word, because actually you mentioned about procurement holiday. Sometimes you actually use the acquisition and procurement interchangeably, but I wonder actually procurement is a much wider concept, including the acquisition of specific weapons. So when you say the procurement holidays, I was a little bit puzzled if that actually procurement is kind of maintaining the current forces and also the things. It's not.
That was the 1990s. Procurement It's over.
It's over, it's okay. So maintenance fee actually sometimes costs much than the acquisition of some specific weapons. So to have more reliability, unfortunately, we have to maintain the force and train and educate them. So it costs much. So I don't know whether it's possible to have that. The other more specific question I'd like to ask you, like, you mentioned about the ground troop cut, especially in the mainland U.S., not the overseas. That's a good point, and also I so strongly support that. But that might affect the augmentation force in case of contingency. So how we can overcome the deployment of additional forces in case of contingency and somewhere else in the region. We strongly advocate deterrent approach will be fine, the defense of South Korea is fine, but the problem, you have made another assumption. If South Korea is going to have more reliable post-defense capabilities, it seems to me that South Korea, whether I'm a little bit concerned with whether the South Korea is able to have the force structures and levels intended to have, because we are also having the financial problem because the economy is good there. So the economy actually works on both countries. The U.S. economy is bad, also our economy is a little bit better than the U.S., but maybe it's not that good enough to ensure that spending a substantial amount of money in acquisition and other things. So but I'm a little bit optimistic about the from long-term view, but from the short to mid-term, I'm a little bit skeptical about this transformation. Also, I don't see any real strategy coming from the United States. For example, during the Bush administration, it was driven by defense transformation and strategic readjustment. But I don't see any kind of grandiose design of the United States to use these forces for the dollar that is driven by only the money. So if there are kinds of discussion going on within the states about the strategic initiative which can be taken by the administration. Thank you.
In the second discussion, we will have Mr. Masayuki Mashita.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Masuda from NIS in Tokyo. I'm a China specialist, so I want to make some small comments and questions to Professor Wang on his presentations. I really enjoyed his paper and presentation because several months ago I also finished writing a chapter on China's foreign and security policy, focusing on prioritization of the foreign policy making process. My paper focus is that today Professor Wang mentioned that there's a lot of actors in the field of Chinese diplomacy and foreign policy making process, including the foreign policy authorities, parties, and other so many actors. But in my paper, focusing on the relations between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and PLA. Because in the case of the security and sovereignty issues, such as the Taiwan issues and the recent South China Sea issues, the voice comes from the PLA is much larger than ever. So my question is that how do you see the role of the PLA in the Chinese diplomacy? For example, last year after U.S. Obama administration decided to send weapons to Taiwan in January, but 2 months later, Chinese government Hu Jintao decided to improve its diplomatic relations with Washington. But in my mind, my image is that below Chinese leadership cannot create a consensus, including the PLA. During the Hu Jintao's visit in last year's, I think April, his meeting with Obama, he never mentioned at the time about the possibility of the improvement of the military-to-military relations. The Chinese PLA finally agreed to improve the military-to-military relations with the United States in autumn. So how do you see the perspective of the Chinese government and Chinese foreign ministry and leadership and PLA? Any contradictions there? And this is my first question to the Professor Wang. Second comment on South China Sea issues. Today, Professor Wang mentioned that DOC declaration on conduct of parties in South China Sea issues. Yes, I agree that Liao Ye at the Shanghai Dialogue said that China stood by the DOC. But still China, and especially PLA, opposed to have a code of conduct in the future, and also matter negotiation. So is it possible for China, my question is that, is it possible for China to accept a multilateral code of conduct in South China Sea in the near future? I think answer would be no, because the recent argument in the domestic China, if you see the internet media and newspaper and CCTV, a lot of media scholars and strategists mentioned that China's priority, policy priority regarding to the South China Sea conflict is to strengthen the military and naval power first. After that, by showing that increasing the expanded power to the surrounding nations in the negotiation, they can resolve the issues in favor of China. So how do you see the different rule of the different negotiation? This is my second question to the Professor Wang. Very limited, or there is some room to negotiate the future joint code of conduct? This is my second question to the Professor Wang. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. As the final commentators, I will invite Dr. Mark Connie, U.S. Congressman Research Service.
Thank you, Professor Ha. If you notice, the organizers of this conference very cleverly had paper givers act as discussants on other papers. I think this was a way to make sure that we read at least one paper in the conference, and maybe as an example of South Koreans exploiting networks. So my job, and that's sort of a nice segue to discussing Professor Chun's very interesting paper. And I think the bottom line that I took from it, and Professor Chun, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the unique developments of sort of this 21st century global system, and particularly the rise of these transnational networks that Foreign Minister Kim also mentioned, provides better chances to overcome what Professor Chun calls the pessimism in both the strands of pessimism in the United States and China, viewing each other's power. And moreover, that this what Professor Chun called the post-Westphalian system of the rise of these complex networks gives middle powers like South Korea much more room to maneuver now than in the future. And I think this, of course, is something that's a very active discussion in the academic literature and also in the policy think tank community where I tend to walk. I have sort of one big overarching comment and then a few smaller ones, which I'll cut short, perhaps if time gets, if I start rambling too much. One comment is that Professor Chun has a lot of optimism, and I think this reveals some of the constructivist arguments. A lot of optimism about the power of these networks to reduce conflict, or the chances of conflict and tension. Professor Chun is not saying that this is inevitable, but I get the sense that he strongly wants it to be so, he believes it to be so, perhaps as well. But it can also work in the opposite direction. I see this in U.S. attitudes towards China, which have undergone, as Professor Chun mentions in his paper, a hardening over the last decade. 10 years ago, you can see a real divide in the United States in debate over China. And you can loosely describe this as sort of the hawks versus the engagers. And over the last decade, policy is really, in the United States, thinking has moved both to the center and also to the right, much more closer to the hawk view. And also the hawks, many of them have come perhaps more to the center. But in general, it's a much more harder line that's coming from the United States. And this is due in part to these very networks that have been operating. And particularly, the business community in the United States has become much more skeptical about China's rise and their status in China, as they perceive, not all, but many perceive that conditions in China with policies such as indigenous innovation have become more discriminatory against them. And so, whereas in the past, 10, even 5 years ago, they were pushing back against the blue team or the hawks in the United States on China policy. Their voices are either much quieter or they're often pushing U.S. policy to be tougher against China. Likewise, I think you can trace the Obama administration's change to a tougher stance towards China. Really towards the beginning of that happened in December 2009 with the Copenhagen climate change talks. So there you have sort of one of these rising new issues of human security, environmental issues, which was pushing the United States towards a harder line. So I guess my point is that, Professor China's maybe if you could sort of clarify, where and in which circumstances these networks might help and where they might hurt. And I realize this might be guilty of the over-theorizing that you were commenting on, but I have to say something critical, so that's something that came to mind. So other points, real quickly. I think, your Professor Chun's opening remarks about middle powers looking for mid-range, concrete strategies for straddling between the United States and China is a good one, and for future conferences it might be interesting to bring other countries that are dealing with this acutely, particularly in Southeast Asia. Among the other countries I cover is Vietnam, and Vietnam feels this quite acutely. But Vietnam has its own issues to deal with it, its own unique way of dealing with this. Professor Wang mentioned they have quite a complex relationship with China, which includes both boosting party-to-party relations, as we just saw last month, or actually earlier this month, I'm sorry, but also reaching out in a much more aggressive way to the United States. So that may be something to think about for our futures, including Vietnamese participants. I could say more, but I think in the interest of time, I'll stop right here.
For the second round of discussions and decisions, I would like to ask three presenters in the reversal order to respond to the interesting and also difficult question raised by great commentators. Mr. Chun.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for great questions. Actually, the first big question is about the core of this argument. Will the new global governance or network type of international relations contribute to a better world, more cooperative world? There should be power politics under the network international relations. So it's very true that United States or China will take advantage of this new multi-layered networks to enhance their national security. That's the core of the so-called realist perspective of network politics. And we cannot predict that under the more denser networks there will be no conflicts. There will be more conflicts, more the clashes of interests. What we expect is that these conflicts will be settled peacefully, not by resorting to the violence. That's what the minimum or the bottom line that South Koreans and other middle powers want. And as Dr. Manning rightly observed, there are more stakeholders. For example, the U.S. trade policy toward China, there will be more business sectors and more private interests. There will be also supranational international relations or institutions. I think that's a good news. They work for the one line to make U.S. China policy tougher, but it can also work for the other direction, make a more cooperative one. Again, the core is that as we have more and more stakeholders, the state actors cannot easily go into the violent process of settling these mechanisms. So if we can expect this, there is another argument about network empire, network type of hegemonic strategy. They are all good because if we have more stakeholders, like third parties, surrounding countries, they will have their own ideas, and it will gets more difficult, to have a military dependent settlement mechanisms. So as I said, there will be power politics under the network politics. Vietnam, when I visit DC, the U.S. policymakers about Vietnam, they have very clever strategies. They sometimes side with the U.S., sometimes talk to China. That's one good strategy. It's a kind of balancer. I'm not a Vietnam specialist, but they are closer to so-called balancer position, whereas, works here is somewhat different. Maybe I would say more advanced than the balancer type, either or type of strategy. So we want to talk to these, the middle powers, Vietnam, Japan, and ASEAN countries. How can we develop a better strategy, not just for these countries' national interests, but also for transforming this East Asian order. So I think it's a very good suggestion that we should have a Vietnamese delegation for this country. Thank you.
Professor Dong Wang. Thank you. I think I got two major questions. One is the role of PLA in China's diplomacy. This, of course, is a very important question and a very complicated question. I think we at least we perhaps need to hold another conference or at least another panel to discuss this question. But to my short answer, I think in responding specifically to the discussion's question, I think the Chinese military's opposition to male-to-male exchanges between China and the United States. Actually, I think this pressure or opposition comes from a number of issues. Mostly, there are three major issues. One is the U.S. arms sales to Taiwan, which I detailed a little bit in my paper. And secondly, also, there's perceived the restrictions of transfer of military technology to China. I think the authorization of the Defense Authorization Act passed, I think, about a number of years ago. And certainly, there is a question of which really, I think, make the Chinese military concerned very much is the surveillance closing to China's territorial waters and the EEZs. So these are the three major issues I think the Chinese military has been very much unhappy with. And I think the treating state actors as unitary, I think, is apparently problematic. And the bureaucratic politics, I think it's not something very unique in China. And the bureaucratic entities, as a bureaucratic entity, the PLA certainly has its own interests, views, and perspectives, and certainly that will translate into the internal policy deliberations and discussion and even debate. And I think, so this is something not very unusual in China's case. For instance, in the United States, we all know the question regarding whether or not there should be a surge in Iraq and Afghanistan, spanning two administrations, has actually generated very vigorous, very lively debate in the United States. But the challenge for leadership, including Chinese leadership, is how to negotiate and how to produce a policy consensus, and at the aggregate level. So I think I'm not particularly sort of worried about or sort of attributing a quote-unquote kind of a negative role, particularly to Chinese military. I think, of course, there will be some, from a scholarly point of view, we all would like to see the Chinese military PLA be more transparent and more open. But I think we also have to be more sort of understanding toward because of the long way there has been. I think gone from the previous kind of way of thinking, but actually I think if we are careful, I think we should be able to note a number of very important progress in terms of the Chinese military being more transparent. And China actually has been doing a lot of things over the decades, to borrowing from Professor Chung's terms, being socialized into a lot of norms. China has actually been one of the major contributors to the United Nations peace keeping operations, at least among the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council. China is the largest contributor. And the Chinese military has also been paying a playing a very active role in the counter-piracy operations in the Gulf of Tonkin, and also Chinese military, I think, about 2 or 3 years ago, has launched its official. The defense ministry has launched its official website, and I would encourage any of you who are interested in Chinese military affairs to take a look. I think I myself, honestly, I was very surprised to the extent of sort of information and openness they have demonstrated. So these are just a few small evidence, and give us reason why I think we, ought to be optimistic about that. And secondly, there is the whether or not China will be willing to negotiate the code of conduct, and certainly I think I would understand this as like 2 layers of question. One is that whether or not China will go for or will be willing to eventually negotiate for code of conduct. And I think if we look at what happens, connect the dots together and try to draw a line, I think the pattern is very clear that China actually has been very much willing to make certain compromises and try to reach the peaceful resolution of the disputes in the South China Sea. And there has been a lot of research out there, and in my own research, I also discussed a little bit about that. So the most recent case is evidence in China's engagement with ASEAN members to sign this, something we can quote intermediate the guidelines for implementation of the DOC. So I think there is reason for us to be optimistic. And the second layer of the question is a more specific tactic. There is the sort of a little bit of disagreement between China and other ASEAN claimant countries regarding the question whether or not they should take a multilateral approach or a bilateral approach to resolve their differences. But I think to the extent the question or disputes or differences are raised, I think it is a matter of approach, not a matter of principle. As long as all sides agree that they should seek a peaceful resolution of the disputes, and I don't think there's a very fundamental disagreement in this principle. So the question becomes a tactics or an approach. And honestly, from a scholar point of view, I think there are merits on both sides of the argument. And certainly, we can understand why China would insist that bilateral approach will be the most effective way in resolving disputes, and why the ASEAN countries will insist a multilateral approach will be better suited for a situation because of the different sides of power, relative power between two sides. They are leading to different bargaining positions and strengths and weaknesses, etc. But I think essentially these are not fundamental differences. And at least I think I do not have enough time to go into more detail, but just give one example, which I touched upon in my presentation. I think at least there is, we have seen some positive outcome coming out of this bilateral approach. At least China and Vietnam, I think, has made very significant progress in terms of reaching agreement, trying to resolve their disputes in a peaceful manner. And then, well, of course, the interesting thing is that Philippines came out opposed that. And honestly, personally, I'm a little bit puzzled by that. I just don't quite understand why, or whether or not they have any ground to oppose that. That's another issue, of course. But overall, I think there are reasons for us to be optimistic about that.
Thank you, sir. And also, again, thank you to the Institute for this opportunity in this conference. A couple of responses to my good friend, Professor Choi. He raised some very important questions. One, he asked about what kind of a broader American policy towards East Asia might be happening or might be in the works, but not yet formally stated in doctrine, and how I focused a little bit more on the military side is right. Secretary Clinton, as many of you know, wrote an article last week in foreignpolicy.com, which perhaps began to move in the direction that the professor has called for, but he's right, doctrine does have a certain place. Personally, I have to admit I'm getting tired of reading the Obama administration's official QDRs and QDDRs and everything else. I get tired of them with any administration. I guess the only one that was really sort of academically interesting was the Bush administration's national security strategy, but that had other problems. That was the preemption doctrine. So most of these documents are pretty dry, and I'm not sure that we should expect too much. But I agree that it would be nice to hear a clearer articulation, especially of how the United States thinks about China. And this gets to Mark's point, Mark made earlier too. Has the United States turned a little more negative or a little more dubious about China in the last year or two? My own perspective is that we really have to search for a little bit clearer of a framework of how to think about U.S.-China relations, and perhaps the Obama administration should try to give a major speech on this. Some of the terms that are used to explain our relationship are not really quite right. And I tried to challenge the use of the term hedging earlier today, and we had a discussion about that last night amongst ourselves. I think that the United States and China are fundamentally in a complex relationship that's both competitive and cooperative. And it's not as if we have to wonder, are we going to be fundamentally cooperative in the future? Are we going to be primarily competitive in the future? No, we're going to be both for a long time to come. The important thing is to keep the competition civil, peaceful, and as much as possible resolvable, but also to recognize that it's there. And we have a lot of issues with our Chinese friends, just as they have issues with some of our policies. And Professor Donghua has talked about some of the issues the Chinese military, for example, may have with the United States today. I would point out that the United States, yes, is quite concerned about a number of trends we see in Chinese behavior. We've already talked about some of the issues with the South China Sea and the Yellow Sea and the East China Sea. But I think one could also mention cybersecurity, and one could also mention intellectual property rights, not to mention exchange rate issues. Now, on the latter point, we understand that China has its own constraints and its own economic worries. But on counter cyber issues and also on intellectual property rights, I think Americans do believe China can and should do a little better. And the fact that China is not doing better is worrisome and reinforces the notion that there is an element of controversy and competitiveness in our relationship, and that things are not all happy, and that we're not allies with China in any kind of traditional sense of the term ally, that there is an element of competition to go along with the cooperation. And by the way, we're not going to anxiously provide a lot of defense technology to China, because even though we do think that there's a lot of benefit at the civilian level in technology and economic cooperation, we are concerned about the rate at which China rises. And we're not convinced that a faster rate would be healthy. We sort of, already are pretty impressed by what China's doing, pretty struck by the pace of the rise, and we're not anxious to make that go even faster at a time when issues such as Taiwan remain unresolved. In other words, when there's still a small chance of U.S.-China military conflict. I think it's small, but it's not zero, and therefore it's unrealistic to ask the United States to lighten up all these military technology exchanges. So the relationship's complex, and perhaps the professor is correct that it's time for an American president to just give a big speech on China, in which he explains this, and doesn't try to make it all a sweet, happy talk, but also avoids the tendency that some people have to get too worried and to make this sound like the new Cold War. It's neither one. It's a fundamentally more complex relationship than we ever had with the Soviet Union. It's generally more good than bad, but it's both, and it's going to stay that way. A couple more specific questions on defense, and I'll try to get through these more quickly. Professor Choi is right. We could see much larger defense budget cuts than I talked about. The current requirement is for about $400 billion in 10-year cuts, depending on what baseline you use to measure it against. I won't bore you with all of that. But he's right. The number could increase by another $500 billion and be in the vicinity of $900 billion over 10 years if sequestration occurs. That would lead to some very uncomfortable decisions and choices for the United States. I'll just say one word. I'll say two words. One, $900 billion would be problematic. It would make it hard for us to sustain what we're trying to do in the Western Pacific and also the Persian Gulf. and also the broader Arab world. However, even if that happens, even if the so-called sequestration occurs this fall, do not think that is the end of the debate. That is the result of one law. We can pass another law, and we can overtake the 900 billion in possible 10-year cuts. So if sequestration happens, it's worrisome, it's problematic, it's not desirable, but it's not the end of the conversation. And I don't know if it would happen in the course of 2012 or have to await the next president's term, but I don't think we're going to make $900 billion in 10-year defense cuts regardless. I could be wrong, because Americans are anxious about their economy, and that leads to some more fundamental questions, and that leads to the burden sharing issue. And so thank you for putting that on the table as well. I have to say to Korean friends, again, two messages. One, thank you for being such wonderful allies. I hope it's a mutual feeling. We both are pretty serious about our security, and we're pretty serious about our alliance. And I think it's, again, one of America's five most important alliances on the face of the earth. However, let's also bear in mind that our burden sharing requests are not unreasonable. We're still spending 4.5% of our GDP on our military at a time when our economy is having huge challenges, bigger challenges than yours. And that's mostly to your credit and our discredit. But it's also true that we created some big problems for our economy, and now we're going to have to square this dilemma of how do we keep a strong global presence while we also try to fix our economy. And we're going to have to ask people to think a little bit harder about helping in ways they haven't before, or more than they have before. Korea is the least of our problems in this regard, in some sense. On the other hand, you're spending 2.5% of your GDP on your defense, and you've got one of the most problematic countries on earth just to your north. We're spending 4.5% of our GDP on defense, and our northern neighbor is Canada. So let's bear in mind that at some point Americans may look at this and say, where's the logic in this? And I believe the first countries to be criticized would be Japan and some of our European allies before Korea. But if America goes in the direction of wondering why we're doing so much when others aren't doing as much, we may not distinguish that carefully between one ally and another. In other words, there could be a general sense of American resentment towards some of our allies that if the economic problems are not redressed and our economy continues to suffer and we have 9% unemployment and a second recession and continuation of trillion-dollar deficits, we're not going to be wondering, okay, do we stay in Korea but pull back from Japan? It's going to be a much more general reaction to our role in the world. And if I were a Korean, I would be wanting to manage that and perhaps prevent that. And therefore, I think the burden sharing conversation needs to happen, and it would be nice if we could ask for some more help. By the way, I think one more point I need to make in this regard. The plan to move half the Marines on Okinawa to Guam may not survive the current budget crisis, because that requires $15 billion in American construction costs on Guam, which I don't think we have. So I think a more likely and a more desirable outcome at this point is to pull 7,000 Marines out of Okinawa and put them in California, because we're going to be shrinking the Marine Corps in the years ahead anyway. So we have room at Camp Pendleton, put them there, and then together with our Japanese friends, buy some equipment, put it on ships that we can station in a place like Sasebo, or maybe even in the Republic of Korea, on ships, in ports, ready to go. So those Marines can fly back to the region and meet up with equipment quickly if necessary. We already have this concept, as you know, with equipment we have in Guam and Diego Garcia. We could do it again with additional equipment, and I think that would be a good way to handle this general challenge. Last point on the issue of the smaller ground forces and how they would relate to the Korea War Plans 5027, 5029, and the augmentation issue. The good news here is that the kind of ground forces that we would wind up with under a $400 billion 10-year defense cut would be very similar to Clinton-era levels. They are not going to be dramatically, in fact, they probably be almost identical to Clinton levels. And as you know, our main challenge in getting to Korea quickly is not really the size of our Army or the size of our Marine Corps, it's logistics and transport capabilities. And these are in good shape right now. We spent a lot of the last 20 years improving our sea lift and our airlift. And of course, an ally like Korea has great infrastructure, which makes it much easier to bring that kind of equipment in. So I think the augmentation issue is not really challenged by going back to 1990's foresights. Thanks.
I'd like to invite a couple of questions from the floor.
My name is Jinyan Kim. I'm with the Hyosung Corporation in Seoul. I would like to ask a question to Dr. Wang. The national diplomatic strategy and defense strategy are ideally to go in tandem to support each other. China's strategy, so expressed in the past, has been friendly relations with all the neighbors. Now, these days, China is complaining that the U.S. is ringing with its allies to isolate China. But in effect, some of the acts that China has been doing in the diplomatic as well as military demonstration is in fact counter to its own interest in that making those neighbors run to the U.S. Or the Filipinos who demonstrated against the U.S. at the Subic Bay and Yankee go home are now practically yelling, America come back. And that's due to the Chinese disputes with them and the manner in which you have handled it. So, question, what are the purposes of Chinese military armament, particularly building the naval force with carriers in the center, patterned after U.S. naval force? What are the Chinese strategy dealing with the global diplomacy and military to support it? I would like to know your opinion. Thank you.
Very important and very tough questions. I'm trying my best to answer, but again, I have to say that I'm not a spokesman for the Chinese government, neither the Chinese military. So I just, from a scholarly point of view, try to give some of my own understanding of those very important questions. First of all, I think I very much agree with your assessment. I think certainly there's a lot of that China needs to sort of reflect upon what happened last year. And my own impression that there are also different perspectives within China. Some people will say, well, it's all because the United States, create all those difficulties for us, and therefore, and the logic goes that we, need to sort of how to counter the American perceived American strategic pressure. But I think there are also, in my own research, I think my finding is that, generally speaking, I think the mainstream policy, foreign policy establishment still, I think, remain very solid-minded. And I think if we look carefully at the text and analysis and those writings of those mainstream foreign policy establishment, I think we will find that there's a lot of, we may call it soul searching or reflection upon what happened and how China, what China can do, should do to reassure its friends, its neighbors. Basically, I think my own view is that China ought to stick to the strategy of reassurance and the cooperation with its neighbors. But it's fundamentally, I think it depends on which perspective really you take. If you believe that it's all created by others who the United States would want to ban on containing China, then the policy prescription will be very different. But if we believe that actually, what China did that might also have made others worried or concerned, then I think then you will arrive the conclusion that we might ought to change some of the ways that we behave toward, we enact with others. So I think this is my hypothesis. This is and I assume this process might have happened, and therefore this is why we have seen recently, especially this year, 2011, China has been more engaged in diplomacy and negotiations and trying to, resolve a lot of differences with its neighbor, including Philippines and Vietnam. And second question, more broader question, purpose about Chinese military build-up. I think I myself not especially in this area. I think others might be more more authoritative voice on that certain subject matter. But I think China's strategy is again is also undergoing a lot of internal debates, and which I also examine a little bit in my own paper. But I think overall, on balance, I think the Chinese strategy, global strategy, I think strategy remains, as I label, very inward-looking and mostly preoccupied with internal stability. But this also caused some problems, particularly when it comes to what the international community outside the world will. It creates some perceptual gap. The Chinese always are very concerned about so-called excessive international responsibility, sort of imposed by others upon the shoulder of Chinese. Very strange and weird idea, but many, I think, Chinese analysts actually believe in that idea. And personally, I believe that China ought to be, in a sense, I think China is still on the way to be a global player. I think Admiral Mullen, he was very nice, I think, a while ago, I think a few months ago, when he was in Beijing giving a speech, and he said China has already become a global player. I think he's been too nice in saying that. And I believe China is still on the way, and maybe there's a long way for China to become a global player. And the question, I think, associated with that is that China really has not been used to thinking in a global strategic way like the United States does. Because whenever the United States think about international affairs, relations, always there's a global perspective. But China still, I think, on the learning curve. So yes, I think China needs to at least at the very highest level of the leadership, or maybe at the scholarly level, that we should think about those broader questions. What China, as China rapidly rises, China's capability is bound to increase further. So how China is going to wield this increased strength, capability, and certainly I think that China's declared strategy is that we stick to the peaceful development strategy, and recently there is a white paper on that. And I think the senior foreign relations policy makers like State Councilor Dai Bingguo, he's perhaps one of the most important persons in the Chinese foreign policy making process. And he, I think, came out as a very strong advocate that China should stick to, and I think he has a whole set of arguments. We can go back and look at his argument. And certainly I think people, senior officials like him, strongly believe that China should not sort of pursue an aggressive or much less expensive strategy. Doesn't make sense at all. For all variety of reasons, China's culture, strategic culture, tradition, and also the reality of global interdependence. There's no way that China, can. So I personally very much agree that China. I tend to be optimistic, and I think the fact that China is rising within this international order, I think it's a really reassuring message to all of us.
Although we have several more questions from the floor, I think we will have to take care of those questions and 2 more sessions in the afternoon. After listening to the excellent presentations and discussions, I do believe that it is a critical moment for us to develop the new visions and also new practice for the co-evolution of East Asian regional order. I think the first session is a good beginning to follow the right direction to have a follow-up discussions on these issues in this act. And thank you very much for our presenters and also commentators. Thank you very much.